The first time Isa saw him, he carried a fence post over one shoulder like it was feather light. His boots sank into the half-frozen mud that rimmed the town. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed toward the hills, as if he listened for something no one else could hear. The townsfolk hardly noticed him. Some spoke of him in whispers: the giant, the mute one. No one offered a name. Isa didn't ask. Her baby, Silas, burned with fever. His cries were thin and sharp in the cold air. Her coat was crusted with river frost from the crossing. She'd lost everything back in Nebraska. The house, the man, the dignity. All she had left was this child, and a dull ache in her back that told her she could not walk another mile. She had hoped Juniper Ridge might show her mercy. A corner in a chapel, a cot by a hearth. But kindness was scarce. The shopkeeper glanced at her tattered dress, frowned, and turned his sign to closed. The preacher offered a prayer and nothing else. The boarding house said, "No children." The blacksmith's wife handed her a crust of bread and said, "Not our problem." Isa didn't cry. She sat in the alley by the livery, cradling Silas as the wind tugged at her hair. People moved around her like she was part of the landscape, an inconvenient reminder of things they could not fix. Just past dusk, she saw him again, the giant cowboy. He cut across the lamplight, dragging 2 long cedar logs with a rope over his chest. He glanced at her once. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He didn't stop. And still Silas, who had been wailing, went suddenly still, eyes fixed on the man's retreating shape. When he turned the corner, the baby made a small sound and curled against Isa's chest. A woman who passed muttered, "They say he don't talk. Ever since his brother died. Some fever had taken the family when he was a boy. He'd been building fences and sleeping alone ever since." Isa didn't answer. That night she slept in the back pew of the chapel with Silas tucked into her skirts and prayed for warmth, for something solid to hold to. In the morning there was a small pile of neatly split firewood waiting on the chapel steps. No note, no footprints, just cedar, fragrant with sap. Her fingers trembled as she brushed snow from the top log. She looked up and down the street. Nobody watched. Still, a column of smoke rolled from the far ridge, the same place the giant had gone the night before. She knew, without knowing how, that the wood had come from him. On the second morning the cold bit deeper. Isa's hands were raw from gathering the last scraps of kindling. Silas had begun to cough in his sleep. She pressed him beneath the threadbare shawl and tried to remember the warm cadence of his father's voice. Words that used to promise, "It's just a bad season. We'll get through it." But there were no more seasons for Joseph, only his frozen grave and the copper wedding ring Isa kept like a hinge that refused to let go. The pile of cedar was nearly gone. If she didn't find more before sundown, the chill would reach Silas's lungs. So she went beyond the alder trees toward the hills where she'd seen smoke. She had no plan, no map of good souls, but Silas needed heat, and she was done waiting for miracles to arrive in church pews. The land rose into rock and scrub and hush. Then she found the cabin rough, set against a sloping boulder, roof thatched with pine, smoke carving a steady ribbon into the sky. Kneeling by the fire pit outside was the man Rowan, stacking split logs with bare hands despite the frost. He hadn't seen her. For a moment she could leave. Silas whimpered, and the man's head lifted. Their eyes met. He was startled still, but not unkind. Isa moved forward slowly, her boots crunching over frost-bitten needles. Rowan stood broad-shouldered and unreadable. He stepped into the cabin and left the door wide. Inside smelled of smoke and pine, and something like safety. She stepped in and found a chair by the hearth, and a pot simmering over the coals. She sat, unwrapped Silas, and pressed her hands to the fire. Minutes later, Rowan returned wordless with another armful of cedar. He set it down, looked at her once, and handed her a blanket from a peg, tossed over her shoulders without ever touching her skin. Isa felt seen in a way she hadn't in weeks. Silas, blinking at the fire, made a small sound. The man smiled once and then walked back to his work. That night she slept in the warmth of the cabin. In the morning, the man was gone, but a wooden bowl of oats sweetened with dried apple slices sat by the hearth, a carved spoon beside it. No note, only a simple breakfast left as if it were habit. She fed Silas first, fingers shaking not with cold, but with a fragile sense of recognition. Later she followed a faint trail of smoke deeper into the trees and found Rowan in a clearing, chopping wood with a rhythm that steadied like breath. He hardly reacted when he saw her, paused, nodded, and went on. She asked quietly if he lived alone. He nodded. Always. Another nod. Why? She asked. He stared, then, in a voice rough and low, said, "Safer that way." When she asked, "For whom?" he muttered without looking up, "You need dry socks." He handed a strip of soft flannel she could hardly believe was meant for her. She felt something like gentleness, a small astonishment in the hollow where fear had lived. When she returned to the cabin, the fire was alive and Silas slept with his mouth soft and even. Isa gasped to see a bowl beside the hearth, finely carved with tiny, dancing figures. Horses, birds, stars, a woman holding a child. She knew the work. It carried the same quiet, deliberate hand she'd glimpsed in the man. She held the bowl to her chest and looked up to find Rowan watching from the edge of the trees. She wanted to ask how he'd known, but the words tangled. She only nodded. He nodded back. Breakfast became a ritual of small gifts left and small mercies given. More cedar, a strip of cloth, a handful of oats. Silas touched Rowan's beard and laughed. The man knelt slowly and let the boy. Finally, the man offered a name. "Rowan," he said, his voice like bark cracking in cold air. Isa told him her name. The sound of it on another's lips struck her as holy. Days passed like this, Rowan providing without demand, Isa rebuilding the simplest things, mending a blanket, laying out 2 spoons where once she had set only one. The two of them did not rush toward each other with declarations. Instead they built space, wood split, soup stirred, small carved toys for a child, and something deep and steady began to take root. One morning a pair of leather boots and a thick woolen cloak waited by the door, folded and stitched, with a scrap of bark reading one word, "Yours." He had left them without fanfare in the night. She ran her hand over the seams and recognized the same rhythm in the stitching. She warmed the boots by the fire. Silas looked at them and asked if they were theirs now. She said yes. Rowan sometimes returned with a limp, a smear of blood, or a story told in fragments. Wolf came close. He'd say he'd been held off. When he once came back wounded, Isa wrapped his arm with steady hands. He watched her fingers with an intensity that made him speak more than he had in weeks. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked. She shook her head. Not once. Those words opened something in hymns. "I've been waiting," he breathed. For what? She wanted to know. For someone who saw without needing to own. They moved through small intimacies. He gave her a braided leather band threaded with a single bead. She wore it with her scars uncovered and unashamed. Silas learned to trust them both, falling asleep between them beneath a mended blanket. Rowan did not ask for gratitude or payment. He came back because he did. Then a rider came, hoofbeats muffled by snow, a man on a fine horse too polished for the woods. He introduced himself as Maddox. He dismounted with the easy arrogance of a man who carries other people's rules. "You Rowan Creed?" he asked. And when Rowan measured him with silence, Maddox smiled thinly and said flatly that Isa belonged to his employer, someone named Royston, because of vows and purchase, because men like that believed paper could bind another human. For the first time since she'd found the cabin door open, Isa's world narrowed to a sharp cold. She had not spoken her last name aloud in weeks. The man advanced, speaking as if she were a thing to be reclaimed. Rowan put himself between Maddox and the child like a stone. The reply he offered was quiet, but absolute. If another man came to take them, he'd bury the body before the snow melted. Maddox sneered at the threat and rode off, but he left a promise in the air. After he left, Rowan poured a line of oil across the threshold and struck a match. A burst of flame rose and then died, but it was enough. Not to conquer a city, only to show that this place would be defended. Isa stood beneath Rowan's shadow and felt, not just the heat of the blaze, but the steadiness of the choice standing beside her. And when spring quietly began to whisper beneath the cold, life unfolded in small, perfect ways. Isa planted herbs under the window. Silas made a scarecrow out of cloth and bark. Rowan carved a spoon small enough for a child's hand. They set 2 places at the table without thinking. They shared the same bowl, the same blanket. Isa no longer felt like a shadow who might be bought and sold. She was present and chosen. The storm that had once threatened to erase everything came again, an avalanche roaring down from the hills. Rowan went out before dawn to hunt. Dusk came and he did not return on time. Isa held Silas and made herself believe he would come back. And he did, soaked and bleeding, with a wolf scar on his forearm and meat for the pot. He sank to his knees and let her tend him. The tenderness in that moment was not offered with any promise. It was simply true. They never rushed to define what this was. There were no grand speeches, no scripted vows. Instead, they kept a flame lit at the threshold and left the door open for those who had walked through fire and lived. The cabin would never hold riches or titles. It held names spoken without shame, meals offered with no ledger, a boy asleep beneath a mended blanket, and 2 spoons on a table carved by hands that had known hardship and had chosen to give. Isa had come with nothing. Rowan had survived with less. Between them, they built something sacred, not purchased, not traded, and not forced, but chosen and earned. They learned how to keep each other, to look, to stitch, to return. If the question is whether someone would have stopped to ask her name, Isa no longer wondered. She had been seen. That was the miracle that kept them alive. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more echoes of the West. Soul, deep stories about what it means to find warmth when winter takes everything. If you saw someone hiding their face in the snow, would you have reached out? Tell us in the comments.